The gunshot echoed through the valley, sending a flock of startled birds into the morning sky as Harriet Thompson squinted down the barrel of her father's Winchester. The shattered remains of a whiskey bottle lay scattered across the fence post 50 yards away, a testament to her marksmanship that would have made most men in Snake River, Wyoming Territory, think twice about crossing her. It was 1876, the year of America's centennial celebration, but here in the untamed West, Harriet had more pressing concerns than patriotic festivities back east. "That's the last one," she muttered, lowering the rifle and tucking a wayward strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. The ranch had been quiet since her father's passing 3 months prior, leaving her alone with a mountain of debts, a dwindling herd of cattle, and an uncertain future stretching before her like the endless Wyoming prairie. The sun climbed higher over the Wind River Range as Harriet made her way back to the modest ranch house her father had built with his own hands 15 years earlier. The Thompson place had never been grand, but it had been home. Now, with the bank threatening foreclosure and most of the ranch hands having moved on to more promising employment, the weathered boards and sagging porch seemed to mirror her own precarious circumstances. Inside, the letter from her aunt in Boston still lay open on the kitchen table where she'd left it. The words seemed to leap from the page. "A woman alone cannot manage in such uncivilized country. Come east immediately. I've arranged an introduction to several suitable gentlemen. Proper society will embrace you once you've shed these frontier ways." Harriet's lips tightened into a thin line. Her aunt's intentions were kind, but the thought of being paraded before Boston's eligible bachelors like cattle at auction made her stomach turn. She'd been born in the West, raised in the saddle more often than in drawing rooms, and the idea of corsets, calling cards, and afternoon teas felt as foreign to her as speaking Chinese. A cloud of dust on the horizon caught her attention. Visitors were rare these days, especially ones approaching from the direction of town rather than the main road. Harriet reached for the Winchester again, cradling it casually in her arms as she stepped onto the porch. In Snake River Territory, caution had kept her father alive for nearly 2 decades. Now it might be all that stood between her and ruin. The rider approached at an unhurried pace, his broad-shouldered silhouette resolving into a man she didn't recognize. That alone was unusual. Snake River wasn't large enough for strangers to pass unnoticed. He rode a muscular buckskin gelding with the easy confidence of someone who'd spent most of his life in the saddle. As he drew closer, Harriet could make out more details: dark hair beneath a well-worn Stetson, a strong jaw shadowed with stubble, and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, including the rifle in her hands. "That's far enough," she called when he was within earshot. "State your business." The stranger reined his horse to a stop, raising his hands slightly to show they were empty. "Name's Ethan Blackburn," he said, his voice carrying a hint of Texas in its drawl. "Looking for Jeremiah Thompson." Harriet's grip tightened on the rifle. "My father passed 3 months ago." "Whatever business you had with him is finished." Something flickered across the stranger's face: surprise, perhaps disappointment. He removed his hat, revealing thick dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. The gesture seemed genuinely respectful. "I'm sorry to hear that, madam." "He was a good man." "You knew my father?" Ethan Blackburn nodded. "Not well. We crossed paths a few times over the years. Last time was in Cheyenne about 6 months back. He mentioned needing an experienced foreman for his ranch." His eyes scanned the property, taking in the empty corrals, the leaning fence posts, and the barn door hanging askew on its hinges. "Said he was expanding his operation." A bitter laugh escaped Harriet's lips before she could stop it. My father had big dreams and an even bigger capacity for self-deception. There was no expansion, just debts. She expected the stranger to tip his hat, offer platitudes, and ride away. Instead, he dismounted, looping his reins around the hitching post as if he'd been invited to stay. "Sounds like you could use a hand then," he said matter-of-factly. "I didn't ask for help, Mr. Blackburn." "No, madam, you didn't." He looked directly at her then, his gaze steady and uncompromising. "But that doesn't mean you don't need it." There was something about his forthright manner that gave Harriet pause. In the months since her father's death, men from town had come with offers, some thinly disguised propositions, others outright attempts to swindle her out of what little remained of her inheritance. None had simply offered help without immediately making clear what they expected in return. "I can't pay wages," she said bluntly. "Not yet, maybe not ever," Ethan shrugged. "I've got some money saved, enough to keep me going for a while." He glanced toward the western pasture where a small herd of cattle grazed. Those Herefords, good stock. With the right management, you could build that herd back up in a couple of years. Harriet's eyes narrowed. "And why would you invest your time in a stranger's failing ranch?" "Your father did me a favor once, never got the chance to repay him." He met her gaze again. "Besides, I've been drifting long enough, looking for someplace to put down roots. Snake River isn't exactly booming with opportunity. Neither is anywhere else for a man with my particular history." There was a story there, Harriet sensed, but she didn't press. Everyone in the West had a past. Some were running from it, others trying to outride it. What mattered was the present, and her present situation was growing more desperate by the day. "1 week," she said finally. "You can stay 1 week. After that, we'll see." Ethan nodded as if a week was all he'd expected. "Fair enough." Harriet led him to the small bunkhouse where the ranch hands had once lived. It was dusty from disuse, but still furnished with 4 simple beds, a wood stove, and a table with mismatched chairs. "It's not much," she said, watching as he surveyed the Spartan accommodations. "It's a palace compared to some places I've slept." He set his saddlebags on the nearest bunk. "I'll get settled and then take a look at what needs doing most urgently." Harriet lingered in the doorway. "Why are you really here, Mr. Blackburn?" He turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Sometimes a man just knows where he needs to be, Miss Thompson." "Harriet," she corrected automatically. "If you're staying, even temporarily, Miss Thompson is too formal." "Harriet, then," he nodded. "And I'm Ethan." As she walked back to the main house, Harriet couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just shifted course, like a river finding a new channel after a flood. Whether that change would bring salvation or further ruin remained to be seen. True to his word, Ethan set to work immediately. By sunset, he'd mended the broken corral fence, rehung the barn door on sturdy new hinges, and rounded up 3 stray calves that had wandered through a gap in the western fence line. He worked steadily, efficiently, with the quiet competence of a man who knew exactly what needed doing and how to accomplish it with minimal fuss. Harriet found herself watching him from the kitchen window as she prepared a simple supper of beans, cornbread, and coffee. It had been months since she'd cooked for anyone but herself, and the task felt strangely domestic after days filled with the more pressing concerns of keeping the ranch afloat. When she called him in to eat, Ethan appeared at the back door, hat in hand, his shirt darkened with sweat from the day's labor. "Wash up at the pump," she instructed, nodding toward the yard. "Towels on the hook." He returned a few minutes later, face and hands clean, hair damp at the temples. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the kind that forms naturally between people accustomed to solitude. "Your father mentioned you," Ethan said finally, breaking the quiet. "Said you could outride and outshoot most men in the territory." Harriet raised an eyebrow. Did he also mention I'm a terrible cook and worse at needlework? A smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth. He might have said something about your biscuits being better suited for ammunition than eating. Despite herself, Harriet laughed. It felt strange she hadn't laughed much since her father fell ill. That sounds like him. Pa never could resist exaggerating, especially when it came to me. Was he exaggerating about your skills? She shrugged. I can handle a rifle and ride well enough. Had to learn. Ma died when I was 7, and Pa never saw the sense in raising a daughter differently than he would a son. She took a sip of her coffee, the bitter liquid fortifying her against memories. The ladies in town never approved, said he was ruining me for marriage. And what did your father say to that? That any man worth his salt would value a wife who could help defend their home and land. Harriet's expression softened. He was a dreamer, my father. Always believed things would work out eventually. Ethan studied her across the table. And you? Are you a dreamer too, Harriet Thompson? I used to be. She stood, gathering their empty plates. These days, I'm just trying to survive. Later, after Ethan had returned to the bunkhouse, Harriet sat alone on the porch, listening to the night sounds of the Wyoming wilderness. Coyotes called in the distance, their yips and howls carrying across the valley. The stars hung low and brilliant in the vast blackness above, unchanged by the turmoil of human affairs below. Her father had loved these stars. God's own campfire, he'd called them, a beacon for wanderers and dreamers alike. Jeremiah Thompson had been both a wanderer who'd finally found his place in this valley, and a dreamer whose visions always outpaced his grasp. Now, with a stranger sleeping in the bunkhouse and the bank's deadline looming like storm clouds on the horizon, Harriet wondered if dreams were luxuries she could no longer afford. The week passed in a blur of activity. Ethan proved himself more valuable than Harriet had dared hope. He repaired fences, doctored sick calves, reinforced the roof of the barn before the spring rains came, and even managed to coax the temperamental well pump back to reliable service. At night, he would join her for supper, their conversations gradually stretching longer as mutual wariness gave way to cautious respect. She learned that he'd fought for the Confederacy as a young man, though he spoke of it rarely and with evident regret. After the war, he'd drifted west like so many others, working cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, trying his hand at mining in Colorado, and eventually finding steady work as a ranch foreman in various territories. What happened to your last position? Harriet asked on the 6th night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Ethan was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. The rancher's daughter took a fancy to me, he said finally. Her father didn't approve. He fired you for that. Seems harsh. There were complications. Ethan's jaw tightened. Her brother took exception. Words were exchanged, then bullets. Harriet's breath caught. You killed him. No, Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the distant mountains, but he'll walk with a limp for the rest of his life. And I figured it was best to make myself scarce before her father decided to finish what the sun started. They sat in silence as twilight deepened around them. Harriet had known from the beginning that Ethan Blackburn carried shadows with him. It was visible in the vigilant way he scanned open spaces. The gun he wore even while mending fences. The nightmares that occasionally sent his voice carrying across the yard in the small hours of the morning. Tomorrow makes a week, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. It does. The barn roof no longer leaks. The fences are mended. The pump works. There's still plenty to be done. Harriet turned to look at him directly. In the fading light, his profile was strong and resolute, his expression unreadable. Why stay? This ranch is barely hanging on. I can't pay you what you're worth. Maybe it's not about money. Then what is it about? He met her gaze then, his eyes reflecting the last embers of daylight. Redemption, maybe, or second chances. I can't offer either of those, Harriet said, more sharply than she intended. Not when I'm fighting for my own survival. Then how about a partnership? Ethan shifted in his chair to face her fully. I've got savings enough to cover the bank note and buy some additional stock. You've got land and knowledge of the territory. Together, we might just make something of this place. Harriet stared at him, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda. You'd invest your money in a failing ranch run by a woman you barely know. I've made worse bets. A smile briefly crossed his face before fading. But I'm not suggesting charity, Harriet. I'm talking about a business arrangement, 50-50, partners. The proposition hung between them, tantalizing in its simplicity. Harriet had been turning over possibilities in her mind for months, selling the ranch at a loss, accepting one of the marriage proposals from the neighboring ranchers who coveted her water, rights more than her companionship, or giving in to her aunt's pleas and returning east. None had felt right. All had required surrendering something essential about herself. I won't be a proper wife, she said suddenly, the words emerging unbidden. If that's what you're angling for, eventually some frontier marriage of convenience that ends with me tending house while you run the ranch, you should know now that I'm not built that way. Ethan's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened. I'm not looking for proper, just real, he said quietly. And I'm not proposing marriage, Harriet. I'm proposing we save this ranch together. The simplicity of it stunned her. No demands for her to change, to become someone else, to abandon the skills and freedoms that made her who she was. Just a partnership between equals, each bringing their strengths to a common goal. I need time to think, she said finally. Ethan nodded, rising from his chair. Take all the time you need, I'll be here. As he walked back toward the bunkhouse, Harriet realized that was what unsettled her most. The certainty that, unlike everyone else in her life, her mother, gone too soon. The ranch hands who drifted away when times got tough. Even her father, for all his love and good intentions, Ethan Blackburn, might actually stay. And that possibility was both the most terrifying and the most hopeful thing she'd encountered in years. The next morning, Harriet rode into town, her mind still wrestling with Ethan's proposal. Snake River wasn't much as settlements when a dusty main street flanked by the essential businesses needed to serve the surrounding ranches and the occasional traveler. General store, saloon, blacksmith, small hotel, church, and the territorial bank that held her mortgage. She tied her horse outside the general store, adjusting her hat to shield her eyes from the morning sun. Inside, the familiar scents of coffee, tobacco, leather, and dried goods greeted her. Agnes Whitaker, the storekeeper's wife, looked up from her ledger with undisguised curiosity. Harriet Thompson, we haven't seen you in town for nearly a month. The older woman's gaze was sharp with interest. Martha Jenkins mentioned seeing smoke from your chimney lately, said you might have company out at the ranch. News traveled fast in Snake River. Harriet should have expected as much. Just hired help, she said neutrally, setting her basket on the counter. I need coffee, sugar, flour, and some of that bacon if you've got it fresh. Agnes began gathering the items, her movements deliberately unhurried. Hired help, is it? That's a change from what I heard. Sheriff Allen said a stranger came asking about the Thompson place last week. Tall fellow, dark hair, riding a buckskin. Said he had business with your father. And so he did. Harriet kept her tone light despite her irritation. He's helping put the ranch in order. All alone out there with a strange man. Agnes clucked her tongue. Your poor father would be concerned for your reputation, dear. My father would be more concerned about the fences getting mended and the cattle being tended, Harriet countered. Mr. Blackburn is a respectable ranch foreman with excellent references. It wasn't entirely true, she hadn't actually checked any references, but it sounded better than admitting she'd allowed a virtual stranger with a mysterious past to take up residence on her property based on little more than intuition and desperation. Agnes seemed unconvinced. Well, if you say so. Still, a young woman in your position must be careful. There's been talk, you know, about whether you can manage that ranch on your own. I imagine there has been, Harriet said dryly. She placed coins on the counter for her purchases. But then, people always seem to have opinions about matters that don't concern them. Agnes's cheeks flushed. I'm only thinking of your welfare, Harriet. We all are. Your father was well respected in this community, and we'd hate to see his only child come to grief or compromise. Harriet gathered her purchases, fighting to maintain her composure. I appreciate the concern, Mrs. Whittaker. Please assure everyone that I'm managing just fine. Outside, she secured her supplies on her saddle, her movements quick and precise. The encounter had left her more rattled than she cared to admit. It wasn't just Agnes, the entire town seemed to be watching her, waiting for her to fail or fall, ready to swoop in with judgment or false charity. She was about to mount her horse when a familiar voice called her name. Turning, she saw Thomas Drummond, the bank manager, hurrying toward her from across the street. His expression did nothing to improve her mood. "Miss Thompson, a word if you please." He was breathless by the time he reached her, mopping his forehead with a handkerchief despite the mild spring morning. "I've been meaning to ride out to see you. About the mortgage payment, I assume." Harriet's tone was resigned. "I'm aware it's due at the end of the month, Mr. Drummond." "Actually, that's just it." He lowered his voice, glancing around as if sharing a confidence. "I've had another inquiry about your property. Walter Jenkins is prepared to make a very generous offer, enough to cover your debt and leave you a tidy sum besides." Walter Jenkins owned the largest ranch in the county and had been trying to absorb the Thompson property for years. Her father had always refused his offers, no matter how dire their financial situation became. "The ranch isn't for sale, Mr. Drummond." "Miss Thompson, Harriet, I say this with all due respect for your father's memory, but the bank cannot continue extending credit indefinitely. The next payment is substantial, and without a clear plan for making the ranch profitable again." "I have a plan," Harriet interrupted, the decision crystallizing in her mind even as she spoke. "And I'll have your money by the end of the month. Good day, Mr. Drummond." She mounted her horse in one fluid motion, turning the animal toward home without waiting for a response. As she rode away from town, the weight that had been pressing on her chest for months seemed to lift slightly. Ethan's offer of partnership suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't just about saving the ranch, it was about defying the expectations of everyone who'd been watching her struggle, waiting for her to admit defeat. The sun was high overhead when she returned to the ranch. She found Ethan in the north pasture, working with a young horse her father had purchased shortly before his death. The colt, a handsome bay with a white blaze, had proven too spirited for Harriet to handle alone. Now, under Ethan's patient guidance, the animal was circling at the end of a lunge line, responding to subtle cues with growing confidence. Harriet watched from the fence as man and horse moved together in an intricate dance of will and trust. Ethan never raised his voice or used force, but somehow conveyed his expectations through the subtlest shifts in posture and energy. It was mesmerizing to witness. When the horse finally stood still, allowing Ethan to approach and stroke its neck, Harriet found herself applauding spontaneously. Ethan turned, a rare full smile transforming his usually serious face. "He's coming along," he said, leading the colt toward her. "Another week and he'll be ready for a saddle." "You have a gift," Harriet observed. "I've never seen anyone gentle a horse that quickly." Ethan shrugged. "They respond to patience and consistency, same as most living things." He secured the colt in a smaller corral before joining her at the fence. "How was town?" "Predictable, full of gossip and warnings about my imminent ruin." Harriet met his gaze directly. "The bank is getting impatient. And Walter Jenkins is circling again, hoping to add our water rights to his holdings." "What did you tell them?" "That I have a plan." She took a deep breath. "Your plan, actually, if the offer still stands." Something flickered in Ethan's eyes, surprise and perhaps something more complex. "It stands," he said quietly, "but I want to be sure you're certain. Once we do this, there's no going back." "I'm certain," Harriet said, surprised to find it was true. "Partners, equal shares, just as you proposed." Ethan studied her face for a long moment as if searching for doubt. Then he extended his hand across the fence between them. "Partners." Harriet took his hand, feeling the strength and calluses that spoke of years of hard work. His grip was firm but gentle, much like the way he'd handled the spirited colt. A current seemed to pass between them, not just a business arrangement being sealed, but something more profound, a promise that transcended words. "Partners," she echoed, and for the first time in months, the future seemed less a looming threat and more a road stretching toward possibility. The next weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. True to his word, Ethan rode into Cheyenne with the bank draft to pay off the most pressing portion of Harriet's debt, and returned with supplies, additional feed, and 3 experienced ranch hands he'd hired from a cattle outfit that was downsizing. The men: Gil Rodriguez, a skilled Mexican vaquero; Joseph Bell, a taciturn former cavalryman with a gift for repairing anything mechanical; and young Sam Tucker, barely 20 but already an experienced drover, quickly settled into the restored bunkhouse. Under Ethan's quiet but firm leadership, they set about transforming the neglected Thompson ranch into a functioning operation once more. Harriet threw herself into the work alongside them, ignoring the raised eyebrows when she rode out with the men to check fence lines or joined the branding of new calves. It was her ranch too, after all, and she knew the land better than anyone. To her surprise, Ethan never questioned her participation or tried to relegate her to domestic duties. Instead, he seemed to take her capabilities for granted, consulting her on decisions and deferring to her knowledge of the local terrain and weather patterns. When she suggested they could increase their herd by rounding up wild cattle that had escaped from various ranches during the harsh winter, he immediately organized an expedition into the high country where the beasts were rumored to roam. They returned 5 days later with 37 head of cattle, a mixed collection of breeds bearing the brands of ranches across 3 territories, many likely abandoned after their owners gave up the struggle against Wyoming's brutal elements. "By law, they're unclaimed property now," Ethan said as they drove the exhausted animals into the home pasture. "We'll notify the territorial office, but most of these ranches have been abandoned for years. After the waiting period, they'll be legally ours." Harriet nodded, too tired to speak. The roundup had been grueling days of tracking skittish cattle through rough country, sleeping on the ground, eating beans and hardtack, and dealing with a sudden snowstorm that had nearly driven their quarry into impassable ravines. Through it all, she'd refused special treatment, working as hard as any of the men. Her muscles ached, her face was wind-burned, and her hands were raw from the rope, but a fierce pride burned in her chest. This was what her father had always intended for her, to be strong enough to face the West on its own terms, That evening, after the men had retired to the bunkhouse, and the house was quiet once more, Harriet soaked in a tub of hot water, letting the heat seep into her bones. Through the open kitchen window, she could hear Ethan moving around the barn, completing final checks on the horses and new cattle. His presence had become a constant in her life, steady and reassuring. They worked side by side during the day, their partnership evolving into an easy rhythm of shared responsibilities. In the evenings, they often sat on the porch, planning the next day's tasks or simply enjoying the companionable silence as darkness settled over the valley. Sometimes, when she caught him watching her with an unguarded expression, Harriet felt something stir deep within her, a warmth that had nothing to do with business arrangements and everything to do with the man himself. But neither of them had broached that territory, maintaining the careful boundaries of their partnership with unspoken agreement. A knock at the back door startled her from her thoughts. "Just me," Ethan called. "Don't mean to disturb you, but there's something you should see in the barn." Harriet rose quickly from the bath, dried herself, and dressed in clean trousers and a flannel shirt. Her hair, still damp, hung in a heavy braid down her back as she made her way to the barn, curious about what couldn't wait until morning. The structure was dimly lit by a single lantern hanging from a beam. Ethan stood beside one of the stalls, his expression uncharacteristically animated. "One of the heifers we brought back," he said, gesturing toward the stall. "She was already carrying. Calf came early." Harriet peered into the stall where a black heifer lay in the straw, a tiny white-faced calf nestled against her side. The mother lowed softly, licking her newborn with gentle persistence. "She's doing well considering," Ethan continued. "Thought you'd want to know our herd just increased by one." The simple joy in his voice made Harriet smile. This big, serious man with his shadowed past and careful reserve, excited about a newborn calf, it was unexpectedly endearing. "He's beautiful," she said, watching the calf struggle to stand on wobbly legs. "Our first official Blackburn Thompson calf. Has a nice ring to it." Ethan leaned against the stall door beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "Your father would be proud, you know, seeing the ranch coming back to life like this." The mention of her father brought a familiar ache, but it was softer now, tempered by the progress they'd made. He never gave up on this place, even when everyone said he was foolish to keep trying. "Sounds like someone else I know." Ethan's voice had dropped to a near whisper. Harriet turned to find him watching her, his expression open and unguarded in the lantern light. For a moment, neither spoke, the air between them charged with something unspoken but increasingly difficult to ignore. "Harriet, a commotion outside interrupted whatever he'd been about to say. The sound of hoofbeats approached rapidly, followed by Gil's voice calling a warning. Ethan's hand moved instinctively to his gun as he stepped between Harriet and the barn door. "Stay here," he said, his tone abruptly all business. Harriet ignored the instruction, following close behind as he moved toward the entrance, her own rifle retrieved from where it hung on the wall. They emerged to find Gil holding a lantern while Sam steadied a winded horse whose rider was slumped forward in the saddle. "Found him on the road," Gil explained tersely. "Says he was ambushed about 5 miles north, took a bullet in the arm." Ethan helped the injured man down, supporting his weight as they moved toward the house. In the better light of the kitchen, Harriet recognized Thomas Jenkins, Walter Jenkins' oldest son. "Thompson," the young man gasped, his face pale with pain and blood loss. "Didn't expect to end up here." "What happened?" Harriet asked, already gathering clean cloths and water to tend the wound. It was a through-and-through shot to the upper arm, painful, but not immediately life-threatening if infection could be prevented. "Cattle rustlers." Thomas winced as she began cleaning the wound. We've been losing stock for weeks. Pa sent me and 2 hands to patrol the North Ridge. They jumped us near the old mining road, killed Pete outright. Don't know about Charlie. Ethan's expression darkened. How many? 4, maybe 5. Didn't get a good look. Thomas hissed as Harriet applied pressure to stop the bleeding. They were driving about 20 head toward the territorial border. Ethan exchanged glances with Gil, a silent communication passing between them. Sam, ride to town, alert the sheriff. Gil, get Joseph and prepare to ride. We'll need extra ammunition and at least 2 days' provisions. You're going after them? Harriet asked, pausing in her ministrations. If they're rustling Jenkins' cattle, ours won't be far behind, Ethan replied grimly. Besides, there's another rancher out there who might need help. Harriet finished bandaging Thomas's arm and helped him to a chair. I'm coming with you. No, Ethan's refusal was immediate and firm. Someone needs to stay with Jenkins and protect the ranch. Gil can do that. I'm the better shot. It's too dangerous, Harriet. She stepped closer, lowering her voice so Thomas couldn't hear. This is still my ranch, Ethan. My partnership, my decision. His jaw tightened, a muscle working beneath the skin. We don't have time to argue. Then don't argue. Harriet moved away, already gathering her own gear. I'll be ready to ride in 10 minutes. An hour later, they were following the rustlers' trail by moonlight, a grim procession of 4 riders armed with rifles and determination. The night was clear and cold, the spring warmth of the day having dissipated with the sunset. Harriet rode beside Ethan, her senses alert for any sign of danger. They're not trying to hide their trail, Joseph observed as they passed another clear set of hoofprints and cattle tracks. Either they're in a hurry or they're not worried about pursuit. Or they're setting a trap, Ethan added, his eyes constantly scanning the darkened landscape. Stay alert. They rode in silence for several miles, following the clear trail as it wound through a narrow valley and began to climb into more rugged terrain. The moon had passed its zenith when Ethan signaled for them to stop. Campfire ahead, he whispered, gesturing toward a faint glow visible through the trees. We'll approach on foot from here. They secured their horses in a sheltered draw and proceeded cautiously, moving from shadow to shadow with weapons ready. As they drew closer, the sound of voices became audible, men talking and laughing, seemingly unconcerned about potential pursuit. Ethan motioned for Harriet and Joseph to circle to the right while he and Gil went left, effectively flanking the camp. Harriet moved silently through the underbrush, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. This was no cattle drive or fence mending. They were tracking armed men who had already killed at least one person. From her new position, she could see the camp clearly. 4 men seated around a fire, bottles passing between them, while a 5th stood guard near a makeshift corral containing about 2 dozen cattle. The stolen animals were huddled together, their brands clearly visible in the firelight, most bearing the Jenkins mark, but at least 6 showing the distinctive Thompson T. Harriet's blood boiled at the sight. These weren't just cattle, they represented the future of her ranch, the hope of rebuilding what her father had started. And these men were stealing that future as casually as they passed their whiskey bottles. A sharp whistle cut through the night. Ethan's signal. Instantly, both he and Gil rose from their hiding places, rifles leveled at the startled rustlers. Don't move. Ethan's voice carried the unmistakable authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. You're surrounded. For a moment, it seemed the rustlers might surrender. Then one man lunged for his gun, and chaos erupted. Gunfire split the night, muzzle flashes illuminating the scene in staccato bursts of orange light. Harriet aimed carefully at the guard by the corral who was raising his rifle toward Ethan's position. Her shot found its mark, and the man fell with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. The firefight was brief but intense. When silence finally fell, 2 of the rustlers lay dead. 1 was wounded, and the remaining 2 had their hands raised in surrender. Ethan moved among them, collecting weapons, his expression hard as granite. "Check the perimeter," he ordered Joseph. "Make sure there aren't more hiding nearby." Gil secured the prisoners with rope while Harriet approached the wounded man, her rifle still ready. "Where's the other rancher?" she demanded. "The one who was with Thomas Jenkins." The man glared at her through pain-glazed eyes. "Why should I tell you anything?" "Because I'm the one deciding whether to take you back for trial or leave you for the wolves," Harriet replied, her voice steady despite the trembling that had started in her limbs as the adrenaline began to fade. "Ravine. 'Bout half a mile east," the man gasped. "Probably dead by now anyway." Ethan appeared at Harriet's side, his face streaked with dirt and gunpowder. "Joseph and I will check. Gil, keep an eye on our guests." He turned to Harriet. "You all right?" she nodded, not trusting her voice. The reality of what had just occurred was beginning to sink in. She had shot a man. That he was a rustler who might have killed Ethan didn't change the gravity of the act. Ethan seemed to read her thoughts. "You did what was necessary," he said quietly. "That's all any of us can do out here." They found Charlie Jenkins alive but badly injured, having crawled into a sheltered overhang after being shot in the leg. The wound had bled heavily, and the man was delirious with pain and exposure. While Joseph returned to help Gil with the prisoners and cattle, Ethan and Harriet worked together to stabilize Charlie, using strips torn from Harriet's petticoat as bandages. As dawn broke over the eastern mountains, they began the slow journey back to the ranch, the wounded men secured on travois dragged by their horses, the recovered cattle plodding behind them in a ragged procession. Harriet rode beside Ethan, exhaustion making her sway slightly in the saddle. "You should have stayed at the ranch," he said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them for hours. Harriet straightened, bristling at the criticism. "Would you have? If I'd asked you to stay behind, that's different." "Why? Because you're a man and I'm a woman." Ethan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face, smearing the dirt further. "Because I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him considerable effort. "Not for the ranch's sake, for mine." The simple admission struck Harriet with unexpected force. In the chaos of the night, with bullets flying and lives hanging in the balance, something fundamental had shifted between them. The carefully maintained boundaries of their partnership had dissolved, revealing the deeper current that had been flowing beneath the surface all along. "Nothing happened to me," she said softly. "We're both still here." Ethan met her gaze, his eyes conveying more than words could express. "Yes," he agreed, "we are." The sun was high when they finally reached the ranch. Sam had returned with Sheriff Allen, who took custody of the prisoners and arranged transportation for the wounded to the doctor in town. Walter Jenkins himself arrived shortly afterward, his relief at finding both his sons alive quickly giving way to gruff gratitude toward Ethan and Harriet. "Thompson," he acknowledged, using her father's name as he always had. "Seems I owe you and your foreman a debt of thanks." "Partner," Harriet corrected firmly. "Mr. Blackburn is my partner in the ranch." Jenkins raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Partner, then." "Either way, you saved my boy's life and recovered my stock." The Jenkins family doesn't forget such things. It was as close to friendship as the cantankerous old rancher was likely to offer, and Harriet accepted it with a tired smile. After years of tension between their families, perhaps this incident would mark the beginning of a more cooperative relationship. As the visitors departed, and the ranch gradually settled back to normal, Harriet felt the full weight of exhaustion pressing down on her. She had been awake for nearly 30 hours, ridden miles through dangerous territory, participated in a gunfight, and tended to wounded men. Yet even as her body cried for rest, her mind remained active, replaying Ethan's words. "I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you." She found him in the barn, checking on the new calf and its mother, his movements slow with fatigue. When he heard her approach, he straightened, something vulnerable flickering across his face before his usual reserve reasserted itself. "You should be resting," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "So should you." Harriet moved closer, stopping within arm's reach. "But I wanted to thank you first, for everything you've done for the ranch and for me." Ethan shook his head slightly. "You don't need to thank me, Harriet. This partnership has benefited us both." "Is that all it is?" She took another step forward, close enough now to see the flecks of gold in his hazel eyes. "A business arrangement," his breath caught audibly. "You know it's more than that." "Do I?" Harriet's heart was pounding now, harder than it had during the gunfight. "I think you should tell me, Ethan, plainly, so there's no misunderstanding." For a moment he seemed frozen, caught between retreat and advance. Then, with a movement that seemed both sudden and inevitable, he closed the distance between them, his hands coming up to frame her face with unexpected gentleness. "I love you," he said simply. "Have almost from the beginning, I think." The words hung in the air between them, honest and unadorned. No flowery declarations, no grand promises, just the truth, offered with the same straightforward integrity he brought to everything. "Good," Harriet whispered, a smile breaking across her face. "Because I love you too." When his lips met hers, it felt like coming home, not to a place, but to a person. To someone who saw her exactly as she was and wanted nothing more. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened, expressing everything words had left unsaid. They broke apart at last, both breathless, foreheads resting together. Ethan's thumbs traced gentle patterns on her cheeks, as if memorizing her features by touch. "I should warn you," Harriet said, her voice slightly unsteady. "I still won't be a proper wife, even for you." Ethan laughed, the sound rich and genuine. "And I'm still not looking for proper," he reminded her. "Just real. You, Harriet Thompson, are the most real person I've ever known." She kissed him again, pouring all her strength and vulnerability, her fears and hopes, into the connection between them. Whatever came next, whether hardship or prosperity, danger or peace, they would face it together. Equals in partnership and in love. The seasons turned, changing the landscape of Snake River Valley as summer's heat gave way to autumn's crisp mornings and eventually to winter's pristine blanket of snow. The Blackburn Thompson Ranch flourished under its partners' combined efforts, the herd growing steadily, the buildings restored to their former solidity, and new structures added as the operation expanded. Word spread through the territory of their success, and of the unusual partnership behind it, a woman who rode and shot and managed alongside the men, and the quiet, competent rancher who stood beside her as an equal. Some disapproved, of course. The ladies of Snake River continued to cluck their tongues at Harriet's unladylike ways, and certain men muttered about natural orders being upended. But results spoke louder than gossip. When the Blackburn Thompson Ranch began producing some of the finest cattle in the region, even the most traditional neighbors found it difficult to argue with success. On a clear December morning, with snow glittering on the mountains and smoke rising from the chimney of the ranch house, Harriet stood on the porch watching Ethan work with a new horse in the corral. His patience was infinite, his movements precise and gentle as he guided the nervous animal through its paces. 7 months had passed since their first kiss in the barn. 5 since their wedding, a simple affair conducted by the traveling preacher with the ranch hands, and a few neighbors as witnesses. Harriet had worn her mother's dress, altered to accommodate her taller frame, and had carried wildflowers gathered from the meadow where her father's ashes had been scattered. Walter Jenkins had attended with both his sons, officially ending the long-standing feud between the families. Even Agnes Whittaker had offered grudging congratulations, though she couldn't resist commenting that Harriet was finally settling down, thank the Lord. Little did Agnes know that settling down for Harriet meant continuing to ride out with the men, participating in cattle drives, and maintaining an equal voice in all ranch decisions. The only concession she'd made to traditional wifehood was moving her belongings into the main bedroom of the ranch house, now shared with Ethan. It was a partnership in every sense: business, household, heart, and body. They worked side by side during the day and held each other through the night, learning each other's strengths and weaknesses, dreams and fears. Ethan's nightmares gradually became less frequent, the shadows in his eyes lightening as he built a new life far from the troubles of his past. Now, watching him work, Harriet placed a hand on her stomach, feeling the slight roundness that had only recently become noticeable. She hadn't told him yet, wanting to be certain before sharing news that would change their lives once more. But 3 missed monthly courses and morning sickness that left her queasy until noon made the truth undeniable. By summer, their partnership would expand to include a new member. Ethan looked up, as if sensing her thoughts, and raised a hand in greeting. Harriet waved back, her heart full to bursting with an emotion she'd once feared she'd never experience. Not the fluttery, insubstantial feeling of romance novels, but something deeper and more enduring: a love built on respect, trust, and shared purpose. She walked down the porch steps and across the yard, drawn to him as always. The horse nickered softly as she approached the corral, already accustomed to her presence after weeks of Ethan's careful training. "He's coming along well," she observed, leaning against the fence. Ethan nodded, running a hand down the horse's neck. "He'll make a fine cow pony by spring. Quick and smart, this one." "Speaking of spring," Harriet began, suddenly nervous despite her certainty that he would welcome the news. "There's something we should discuss." Ethan turned his full attention to her, that quiet intensity that still made her breath catch after all these months. "Everything all right?" "More than all right." She reached for his hand, guiding it to rest against her stomach. "We'll be needing an extra bedroom by summer, maybe a cradle too." For a moment, Ethan stared at where his hand rested against the slight swell of her abdomen, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension and finally to wonder. "A baby," he whispered, as if speaking too loudly might somehow make the miracle disappear. Harriet nodded, watching his face carefully. "Due in June by my calculations." "June," he repeated, a slow smile spreading across his features. Then, with a whoop that startled the horse, he vaulted over the corral fence and swept Harriet into his arms, spinning her in a circle that left them both laughing and breathless. "Careful," she protested, though she couldn't stop smiling. "I'm in a delicate condition, or so they say." Ethan set her gently on her feet but kept his arms around her waist. "Delicate is the last word I'd use to describe you, Harriet Blackburn, but precious, irreplaceable, extraordinary, those fit." She leaned into him, savoring the solid warmth of his chest against her cheek. "You're not worried about how we'll manage with a child? We've faced rustlers, bank foreclosures, and your aunt's horrified letters about your unsuitable marriage," Ethan reminded her, his voice rumbling pleasantly under her ear. "I think we can handle one small person." Harriet laughed. You might regret those words at 2 o'clock in the morning when that small person is demanding attention. Never. He tilted her face up to his expression serious despite the joy shining in his eyes. I will never regret anything that comes from loving you, Harriet. Not one moment, not one challenge, not one sleepless night. She believed him. That was perhaps the most extraordinary gift of their partnership, the absolute trust that had grown between them, rooted in actions rather than mere words. So, Ethan said after a moment, his hand moving again to rest protectively over her stomach. A June baby. Boy or girl, do you think? No way to know until the arrival, Harriet replied. Does it matter to you? Not in the slightest. He smiled, the expression transforming his usually serious face. Although I do hope, regardless, that they inherit your spirit and determination. And your patience, Harriet added, and kindness. Sounds like a formidable combination. It is. She looked around at the ranch that had once seemed destined for failure, now thriving under their joint care. Just look what it's accomplished already. That evening, as snow began to fall again, they sat before the fire in the ranch house, making plans for the future that now included not just cattle and land, but a child who would inherit the legacy they were building. Ethan sketched designs for a cradle he would craft himself, while Harriet sorted through her mother's stored trunk for baby clothes that might be refashioned. Your father would be proud, Ethan said as she held up a tiny yellowed gown. To see the ranch flourishing, to know his grandchild will grow up here. He would have loved you, Harriet agreed, setting aside the gown, for seeing me as I am, not as others thought I should be. How could I see you any other way? Ethan reached across to take her hand. It's who you are that I fell in love with, your strength, your determination, your refusal to conform to others' expectations. Even when I'm stubborn and difficult, she teased, especially then. His thumb traced patterns on her palm. I never wanted a proper wife, remember, just a real one. And you, Harriet Blackburn, are the most genuinely real person I've ever known. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white, while inside, the fire burned warm and bright, casting golden light over the man and woman who had defied convention to forge their own path. Not the easiest path, certainly, but one that rang true to both their hearts. As June approached, the ranch burst into vibrant life, wildflowers carpeting the meadows, new calves frolicking on strengthening legs, and the promise of abundance in every greening field. Harriet's body changed too, her slender frame softening and expanding to accommodate the growing child within. She continued to participate in ranch operations, though she grudgingly allowed Ethan and the hands to take on the more strenuous tasks as her pregnancy advanced. Instead, she focused on the financial aspects of the business, discovering an unexpected talent for negotiation when she secured a contract with the Army for a substantial portion of their herd at premium prices. You're a natural businesswoman, Ethan observed after she returned from a meeting in Cheyenne, her satisfaction evident despite the fatigue of travel in her condition. Your father never mentioned that skill. He probably didn't know, Harriet replied, easing herself into a chair with a sigh of relief. He always handled those matters himself, and not always successfully. His loss, our gain. Ethan knelt before her chair to remove her boots, his hands gentle on her swollen ankles. This contract will set us up well for expansion next year. Harriet leaned back, enjoying the simple pleasure of being cared for by someone who asked nothing in return except the opportunity to ease her comfort. I was thinking about that, she said, closing her eyes as he began massaging her tired feet. The Palmer property to the east is available. Their family's moving to California, and the land adjoins ours near the best water source. Ethan's hands paused momentarily. "You're 8 months pregnant and still planning ranch expansions. The baby's not here yet," she pointed out reasonably. "And my brain works perfectly fine, regardless of the state of my waistline." He laughed, resuming the massage. "That it does. All right then. Tell me more about this Palmer property and why we should consider it." They discussed the potential acquisition late into the evening, weighing the benefits against the additional responsibilities, each contributing their perspective to the decision. By the time they retired to bed, they had developed a plan to approach the Palmers with an offer contingent on the success of their Army contract. It was this balance of shared goals and complementary strengths, of mutual respect and unwavering support, that had become the foundation of their marriage. Not the traditional arrangement that Snake River society had expected, but something uniquely suited to their particular natures. 2 weeks before her expected delivery date, Harriet woke in the night to a sharp pain that stole her breath. Beside her, Ethan slept peacefully, one arm flung above his head, his face relaxed in a way it rarely was during waking hours. She slipped from bed quietly, not wanting to wake him until she was certain. Moving to the window, she braced against the sill as another pain gripped her, stronger than the first. Outside, the moon hung low over the mountains, bathing the ranch in silver light. "Harriet." Ethan's voice, rough with sleep, came from behind her. "What's wrong?" "I think it's starting," she said, turning to face him. "Earlier than we expected." He was out of bed instantly, fully alert. "I'll get Gil to ride for the midwife." Harriet nodded, another contraction building. "And a leaner," she added, referring to their nearest neighbor, a capable woman who had assisted at many births. "Tell him to hurry." The next hours passed in a blur of pain and anticipation. The midwife arrived promptly, having been staying in town for another birth, while Alina Jenkins appeared just as dawn was breaking, bringing with her linens, herbal remedies, and the calm efficiency of a woman who had borne 5 children of her own. Ethan was banished to the porch, as was customary during childbirth, though he paced the wooden boards like a caged wolf, startling at every sound from within. Gil and the other hands gave him a wide berth, recognizing the mixture of fear and helplessness that made his movements jerky with suppressed energy. Inside, Harriet labored with the same determination she brought to every challenge. When the pain threatened to overwhelm her, she focused on the thought of the child who would soon join their family, a tangible embodiment of the love she and Ethan had built between them. "You're doing well," the midwife encouraged as the contractions intensified. "Not much longer now." Alina wiped Harriet's brow with a cool cloth. "First babies often take their time," she said soothingly, "but yours seems eager to meet the world." When the final stage came, Harriet gathered her remaining strength, bearing down with everything she had. The pain crested to an almost unbearable peak, and then suddenly release, followed by the most miraculous sound she had ever heard, the indignant cry of her child entering the world. "A boy," the midwife announced, quickly cleaning and wrapping the squalling infant. "Healthy and strong, just like his mama." Tears blurred Harriet's vision as the tiny bundle was placed in her arms. A son. Their son. His face was red and wrinkled, his head covered in dark fuzz that promised to become hair the same shade as Ethan's. As she watched, his eyes opened briefly, revealing a glimpse of unfocused blue before closing again. "He's perfect," she whispered, tracing a finger along his miniature features. "Shall I get your husband?" Alina asked, smiling at the tableau of mother and child. Harriet nodded, unable to tear her gaze away from her son's face. "Tell him to meet his boy." Moments later, Ethan entered the room, his expression a mixture of awe and trepidation. He moved to the bedside, perching carefully on the edge as if afraid his weight might somehow disturb the delicate scene. "We have a son," Harriet said, shifting the bundle slightly so he could see the tiny face. "Jeremiah Ethan Blackburn, if you agree, after my father and his father." Ethan's hand, so large and capable, hovered uncertainly over the infant before gently touching the downy head. "Jeremiah," he repeated softly. "It's a good name, a strong name." "Would you like to hold him?" Harriet asked, recognizing the longing in his eyes. With exquisite care, Ethan gathered the swaddled infant in his arms, cradling him against his chest with a natural protectiveness that made Harriet's heart swell. Father and son regarded each other solemnly, forming a bond that transcended words. "Hello, Jeremiah," Ethan said, his voice gentler than Harriet had ever heard it. "Welcome to the ranch. Your mother and I have been waiting for you." As if in response, the baby's tiny hand emerged from the blankets, fingers splayed. Ethan offered his index finger, and the infant grasped it with surprising strength, holding on as if he would never let go. It was a perfect moment, not because everything had gone according to plan, or because their lives were without challenges, but because in this room, with this child between them, Harriet and Ethan had created something entirely new and completely their own. Not a proper family by society's rigid standards, perhaps, but a real one built on love, respect, and the courage to forge their own path. "I love you," Ethan said, looking up from their son to meet Harriet's gaze. "Both of you more than I ever thought possible." "And we love you," Harriet replied, reaching out to cover his hand with hers, feeling the baby's grip still strong between them. "Our unconventional, imperfect, absolutely perfect family." Outside, the sun rose fully over Snake River Valley, illuminating the ranch that had once teetered on the edge of failure, now thriving under the care of the woman who wouldn't be a proper wife and the man who had never wanted proper, just real. Within the room, 3 hearts beat in a new rhythm, a family created not by convention but by choice, bound together by love stronger than any social expectation could ever be. And in the years that followed, as Jeremiah grew from infant to toddler to boy, joined eventually by a sister with her mother's determined spirit and her father's patient eyes, the Blackburn Thompson Ranch became known throughout the territory, not just for its fine cattle and fair business practices, but for the remarkable partnership at its heart. A partnership that defied convention, embraced reality in all its messy glory, and proved that sometimes the most beautiful things grow from the courage to be exactly who you are.